one type of abuse, there's almost always some other type of abuse.
I had to beg for money, and then I had to figure out who was going to get paid and who wasn't.
I had to beg for money to pay for my prescriptions. I had to beg for money for food.
I had to ask permission for anything outside of what was accounted for the home or the kids. There was never anything outside of that.
Every year, an estimated 2.1 million people later in life experience abuse, neglect, or exploitation. Vulnerable older adults face especially high risks of financial, physical, and psychological abuse. Very frequently, family members or caregivers are the perpetrators, and too often, these abuses go undetected or are seen as private family matters that should be kept hidden behind closed doors. This secrecy makes it all the more difficult for elders to escape the abuse and for formal and informal networks of care to give them the help they need to move forward. Because elder abuse has historically been viewed as a social rather than a criminal problem, most states did not establish adult protective services units to address elder abuse until the mid-1980s. The extent of elder abuse is unknown, in part because of the lack of definitive and comprehensive research in the field. Because the perpetrators of elder abuse are often family members or acquaintances, these incidents are likely being underreported. We do know that low household income, being unemployed or retired, being in poor health, having experienced prior traumatic events, and having low levels of social support will make it more likely that an older person will experience mistreatment. It will take the coordinated efforts of public agencies, nonprofits, and community members to address the complex dynamics of elder abuse and exploitation. Domestic and sexual violence advocates can make a difference by tailoring their services to the unique needs of older participants. The Aging Services Network and others who frequently come into contact with elders, such as those in the healthcare and financial services industries, can help by learning how to recognize and report signs of abuse. Adult Protective Services investigates reports of possible abuse, intercedes in dangerous situations, and supports law enforcement's efforts to hold perpetrators accountable. And all of these partners can help to shine a spotlight on elder abuse and exploitation so that it will be better understood and more effectively combated by society as a whole. Financial exploitation is the illegal or improper use of an elder's funds, property, or assets. The perpetrator uses these financial resources without the knowledge or consent of the vulnerable person, in some cases because the person does not have the capacity to consent, and in other cases because the person is under the physical, emotional, or psychological control of the perpetrator. This type of exploitation leaves the vulnerable person without the financial means to meet his or her own personal needs. Unlike fraud, which is typically committed by a stranger, financial exploitation is committed by a person who is known to the senior, typically a family member or caregiver, often a spouse, an adult child, or an extended family member or other person in a position of trust.
And what happens is they manipulate funds, assets, or property for their own use.
Financial exploitation is actually often the hidden abuse because very often law enforcement, other allied agencies come into an elder's life because of a call for some other type of concern.
It's one of the categories in abuse where it's not seen because you don't really know you're being abused to your light bill is not paid, your mortgage is not paid, something bouncing on your bank account.
They might be asking for a lesser amount of their prescription. They might be asking for transportation provided by medical facilities because they don't have access to finances to transport themselves. Sometimes when the victim stands up for themselves, then it becomes physical. And sometimes it's not physical on their body. It can be a fist in the wall, it can be kicking a footstool around, or injuring the pet.
The purpose of the physical abuse may be, in fact, to effectuate financial exploitation.
When it comes to elder financial exploitation, it is a crime of the 21st century.
Awareness needs to be higher among people and agencies that work with elders because financial exploitation is an epidemic across the country. And in Florida, the population of elders is the highest, and it's going to continue to grow.
Florida has over 4.7 million seniors age 60 and above living here currently. And with baby boomers aging, that number is just going to skyrocket. And it's important as advocates, people who work with seniors or may come into contact with them, that if we don't address the problem of abuse, neglect, and exploitation, it's just going to get bigger.
The main goal of the investigation is to protect the vulnerable adult from any further abuse if it has occurred or any financial exploitation, and concentrate on the safety of that individual.
At the local levels, we partner with area agencies on aging, aging disability resource centers, law enforcement, many people in the community who might come into contact with seniors, which is just about everyone. We also partner with the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence.
FCADV and the 42 certified domestic violence centers across the state of Florida want to make sure that all survivors, regardless of their age, have access to the resources and services that all survivors do.
Sometimes they're just looking for a friend and they reach out to the wrong people, or the wrong people reach out to them, and they take advantage of the situation.
We had one case where a gentleman allowed a woman to move in and they became boyfriend and girlfriend, and she started taking advantage of the access to his finances. She would access his debit card, take his debit card and use it for her own purchases and things along those lines, with a promise that she would repay him. But he was actually, his home was now going into foreclosure because she had not ever done that, and he was about to lose his home.
I was involved in a case one time several years ago where a woman in her late 90s was sexually and physically abused by a family member. This, of course, was very traumatic. Luckily, law enforcement, the whole community came together, and so he was prosecuted and sent to prison. It was discovered later through advocates helping her and working with her that financial exploitation had also occurred in ways that some people would consider perhaps fairly minor, because it was she was saving money for a prepaid burial plan and giving money to the family to apply to this burial plan, but they were using it for themselves.
About 10 or 15 years ago, it appears the caregiver needed some money and asked for a loan. And that graduated into, by the time that she was arrested, had been asking for money, $200, $300 every day that she worked. And that would be sometimes 4 or 5 days a week, under the guise of it being a loan, and saying that she would pay it back.
Giving a family member or someone else a credit card, and they say, you know, get some money out and buy my medicine. Obviously, after the bank account's been cleared out, you can't really fix that. Putting someone on a bank account for convenience sake. Again, the person who's on the bank account can clean the bank account out.
What we're seeing is someone will go to the counter and they'll want to take out $50,000. And, you know, banks generally aren't going to ask the question, well, what are you doing this for? It's their money. But we do get those suspicious reports. They'll call and say, hey, this person's moving a lot of money, or we're suspicious of this because someone's coming in and using this person's account.
And of course, one that's unfortunately very prevalent is putting someone else's name on the deed, which is a transfer of real estate. And once done, is very difficult to undo. I mean, you have to go to court, you have to allege the foundation to get it undone. And unfortunately, many older people think that they can undo it as easily as they did it. You know, with all the credit card offers that come into everybody's home these days. It's relatively easy for a family member who has access to all of the identifying information to apply for credit in the name of the older person and get access to those credit cards.
The signs of financial exploitation or financial abuse can be subtle. Things like termination of vital utilities, such as telephone, electricity, multiple unpaid bills and liabilities despite adequate income. Checks written to cash, unexplained disappearance of assets, property liens, or foreclosure notices. The medical community is in a unique position because they do come into contact quite often with people later in life. So they should be aware of if someone is coming in for their appointment and it seems that they're not taking their medications because they're not able to fill it. They have quite a few canceled appointments because they're unable to pay the copay. If their spouse, their caretaker, does not seem to want them to be in their appointment by themselves, this should also be an alert to the medical community that there could be signs of abuse.
As people age, we need much greater help in our lives. There may be need to have someone come in and help with just the daily routine of living, bathing and taking medicine and that sort. There often, of course, needs to be help with financial affairs, paying bills, and this makes people vulnerable because someone else has to do that. It may be a paid caregiver, it may be a family member, but those vulnerabilities enable bad actors to come in and financially exploit older people.
Say the daughter is the power of attorney. She's responsible to make sure that her mother or father receives everything they need in their home, because most people want to be in their home, that the services are being provided. They find out, well, in-home services cost too much, so I'm gonna be the one to provide the care for them, and in turn take their money as well, get them to sign over the deed to their home.
Once someone is moved in with an older person, and this is a common scenario, nephew comes and says, oh, aunt, I'll move in with you, I'll help look after you, I'll mow the grass, I'll help with the yard, give me a place to stay, that'll be great. And it sounds like that it's a good idea, and a lot of older people would love to have a family member move in and help out. And a lot of those situations are completely legitimate, but if they aren't, or if they go bad, it's difficult to get the person out of the house. They have acquired a legal interest in staying in the home, especially if there's been some kind of an agreement, especially if they're paying rent, which sometimes they're paying a small amount of rent, or have in the past. And so an attorney actually has to go through an eviction process.
She made her father sign over the bank account, pretty much the whole estate. And she used that to fund her life, her vacation, her lifestyle. And when we received the report, the two victims were actually in the home by themselves. They were unkept, they had no food in the home, and the daughter believed that she was doing nothing wrong, that it was, they were gonna die anyway. It was gonna be her money, so why not spend it ahead of time?
Often a parent is not going to want to completely sever a relationship with a child.
And it's very hard for a senior to come to terms with the possibility of being responsible for sending a loved one to jail, and or they've been threatened. Hey, if it wasn't for me, you would be in a nursing home, nobody else cares about you. They use that emotional abuse and psychological abuse for control, and that's how they control and keep people from making those reports.
They may not want it to come to light that they might have been exploited because their family members may want to put them into a nursing home. They may be afraid if someone reports it for them, or if they report it, that they'll be forced out of their homes.
In another type of financial exploitation, an abusive partner in a marriage or similar relationship exercises control over all or most of the money and property of the family and denies the other partner access to those resources.
You have to ask them to be able to use the money, or you have to report back on what you're using the money for.
The only time I had cash or money in my hand was when my husband would give me money for food each week when he got paid.
It's their way of controlling another person's life.
And it's very demeaning to the person being controlled financially, because they have to beg for what sometimes is just simply necessities.
It makes you feel about not even that high.
They have to ask permission for medication, or they have to ask permission to have gas put in their car, and then they're only given a limited amount.
It is common for this type of financial exploitation to occur in combination with other types of domestic abuse, such as physical, sexual, or psychological abuse and neglect. This type of exploitation may actually begin when the individuals involved are younger and continue into the senior years, when it will likely become more and more difficult for the vulnerable person to escape the abusive situation.
We went shopping one day to the food store, and I had put something in the cart that he didn't approve of, and he got angry at me. So on the way out to the car, he started shouting at me, complaining that, why am I putting in something in the cart that we shouldn't really need or didn't need? And I just cowered and got in the car and we went home. And then when we got home, I guess I said the wrong thing and he slapped me. So that was just the beginning, but he was very sorry afterwards. And it just kind of set the whole basic pattern of our life. Money was the issue.
Sometimes financial exploitation starts with emotional abuse, and then other times it creates emotional abuse.
The emotional strain of that was beyond words.
It's so controlling over your thoughts during the day of what you want to spend your money for, but you cannot because you have to answer to somebody that maybe is raging at you.
I lived on eggshells 24/7 in fear of, he had serious anger issues.
Abusers may intimidate their victims and prevent them from reporting the exploitation or abuse out of fear of retaliation.
It's the intimidation. It's the knowing that he can and that he might.
I always was worried about what he will do to me next, because there was a lot of fear that I had with him. One day, he said to me, if you ever divorce me, you'll never divorce me. I'll put a gun to your head and I'll shoot you. And you'll never have my money.
They may also lie and manipulate family members, friends, and professionals in order to hide or justify their behavior.
He would call my friends and tell them that he was worried about me, and he'd be crying and she doesn't like being around people, and not to call me and do anything. And so they didn't want, because it upset me, and they didn't want to hurt me, so they did what he said because he sounded so sincere.
And he never showed this to other people. It was always only when I was alone. It was only between us.
It's not always easy to identify financial abuse. So when the participant comes into my office, I usually bring out the power and control wheel and have them highlight the things on there that they recognize is happening in their life. And usually that's when I understand, and they also, their eyes are opened also to the fact that there is financial abuse going on.
His ability to control me, control everything I did, that kept me locked into that position.
They use a term that we use here in domestic violence called coercive control. And so they make the victim feel comfortable or encouraged about letting them take control over their finances. So they might say, we don't need 2 cars, it's too expensive, so let's cut back on sell your car, and that gives them control over then the activities of that person that had the car, which makes them feel good about, oh, we're saving and they care about me and they want to give me rides, and then it doesn't happen. One of my participants actually was only allowed to travel within a 5-mile radius of their home, and when she returned home, the abuser would check the mileage to make sure she hadn't gone outside that 5-mile radius.
I'd have to beg for the money in order to go to the grocery store, and then he always wanted to go along.
When it was time for bills each month, he made me stand next to him and go over the checkbook. And if I wrote checks and if I made a mistake, I was really told, scolded and made made to be afraid.